So I'd like to invite the next panel up. The moderators, the moderator Vincent Rigby, Maître Landry, Marie-Claude Landry, and Maître Philippe-André Tessier from the Quebec Human Rights Commission, Maître Landry from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I'm just going to do a very brief intro. Please have a seat. Adjust the seat if you can. I don't know if there. I think there's a. I don't know if the seats can be adjusted, but. So I'm just going to introduce Vincent and then ask him to introduce our speakers here today. So Vincent Rigby is a long-standing public servant in Canada at the federal level. He holds an MA in diplomatic and military history, so we have another discipline represented up here as well. He was the appointed National Security and Intelligence Advisor at the latter part of his career to the Prime Minister of Canada in January 2020, retired in September 2021. And prior to that, Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at GAC, Global Affairs Canada, and Minister of Public Safety Canada from 2017 to 2019. And I'm delighted that he is our colleague at the Max Bell School of Public Policy as the McConnell visiting professor. Thank you very much, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Pearl. Greatly appreciate it. And as Pearl just said in recounting my biography, I think it's pretty clear I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a human rights expert. So I'm kind of echoing what Chris said to kick off the session today. But I have to say that the conversation up to now, apart from being absolutely fascinating, has really resonated with me. And when Pearl first came to me and said, chair this session, I went, do you think I'm really right? I don't know anything about the word decision. I saw the video, et cetera, et cetera. But as I'm listening to this conversation today and I'm hearing words like public safety, and I'm hearing words like restorative justice, harm, online harm, incitement to violence, ideologically motivated violent extremism. I mean, this is stuff I did as the NSIA to the Prime Minister, and I was the Associate Deputy Minister to Public Safety for 2 years, working with Ralph Goodale. So these things were right up my alley. So you were right. This is actually very much in my wheelhouse. So I'm really, really happy to be here. So fascinating conversation up to now. I think what we want to do with this panel is what I like to say, move it up and out a little bit. So the first session, very focused on the legal rights implications. Second session on the individual impact and on humans, communities, et cetera. I think what we want to talk about here a little bit with our two distinguished guests, whom I'm going to introduce you to in a second, is really the impact on society more broadly, but in particular on public institutions. And so we've talked a lot about public institutions, but now we've got two practitioners who can actually talk a little bit about the impact of the Ward decision and more broadly the impact of growing hate speech, which I think is really a problem in Canada that is exponentially on the rise. And I'm sure both of our panelists are going to talk a little bit about it. The regulatory regime, maybe we'll get a little bit into the online space, which has been talked about. So there have been a lot of little threads that have been hinted at in a bit of in a tantalizing kind of way. Maybe we'll get to them today, hopefully, I hope in the next 45 minutes or an hour. So with that long-winded introduction, let me introduce our very, very distinguished guests. And I have to say, we're extremely honored and very pleased to have both of them. I'm going to kick off with Marie-Claude Landry, just to my left, who is, of course, Chief Commissioner and CEO of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And I did not know you were about to retire. I made a joke on the phone about that the other day, and you didn't say anything to me. So congratulations. Thank you. That's wonderful. Bad for us, but good for you, moving on to bigger and better things, I'm sure. She was appointed in 2015 as the head. She has a law degree from the University of Sherbrooke, and she founded her own law firm in Cowansville, Quebec in 1993. I went on the website to look at your bio, and the list of distinctions and awards, I mean, it's unbelievable. I could spend the next half hour talking about them, but you know what jumped out at me was your devotion to community, and you've done so much work with vulnerable communities, which I'm sure informs the work that you do as head of the commission, but I'm sure that's going to come up today. Immediately to my left is Philippe-André Tessier, who I'm sure many of you know, President of the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission. That body's come up a couple of times already. This morning you were appointed President Philippe-André in 2019. I think you'd been there as acting president for a year. And I think you'd served on the board even for a couple of years before that. Prior to his appointment, he worked at the Robinson Shepherd Shapiro Labor Law Group as a lawyer and certified industrial relations counselor, graduate of U de Montréal, just down the street. and a member of the Quebec Bar. So we have two heads of human rights commissions, one at the federal level, one at the provincial level. Brilliant decision to bring these two together. And so I'm going to fire a number of questions. We're going to have a very casual conversation and see if we can play up some of the issues that I just talked about, but we're probably going to come back to some of the issues that have already been discussed, and we're going to get a perspective, a Human Rights Commission perspective on some of this stuff. So a nice big fat curveball to kick you off that you can hit out of the park. But I mean, from your perspective as the heads of Human Rights Commissions, what have been the big implications of the Ward decision for, I mean, Canadian society, but for your institutions in particular? What have been the consequences, and how has this impacted you and your work? Marie-Claude, maybe you can kick it off, and then
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be with Philippe-André, a colleague, but also a friend on the stand this morning, and thank you for this opportunity. Let me begin by saying, which is very important, that the Canadian Human Rights Commission acknowledge and respect decisions made by the Supreme Court of Canada, but we're still deeply concerned by what happened in this decision and the effects that will have. We know, and we heard foes say that hate starts with words, and we know that this is the case, and it's really harmful, and we're really concerned about the policy impact and what kind of, is it now a free pass to say everything that crosses in our mind and do propaganda and just hurt people? And this is really what I'm concerned about as a chief commissioner, as a human being, as a woman, as a mother of 3 kids, and as a grandmother. What kind of society we want to create, what kind of society we are living in. And I think that as the Chief Commissioner and as a Human Rights Commission, and for every citizen, we need to stand for what we believe in, the value, and we need to stand up and say so. That it may be lawful, but it's awful, and it's not acceptable. And we have to keep in mind that Quebec is not immune, and certainly Quebec has experienced a huge increase in hate and intolerances. We are seeing that every day. And we also need to say that amongst the leaders country, the G7, Canada actually has experienced the highest increase of hate amongst the G7, which is highly concerning. Then again, it may be lawful, but it's awful. Is it acceptable in a society that value dignity, respects for everyone, and equity? I don't think so. And we need to keep in mind that hate is a denial of value of tolerance, inclusion, diversity, and the very essence of human rights and the very essence of humanity. And I think that this is what we need to keep in mind. And as a Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, this is what I'm standing for.
Great. Thank you very much.
Merci, Marie-Claude. Thank you, Vincent. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Just heading a Human Rights Commission is never an easy task. Any public body, but especially Human Rights Commission. Because what you're dealing with are fundamental rights and freedoms, rights and freedoms. And as was eloquently put this morning, as you can see, these rights and freedoms, they're opposed sometimes. And the difficulty for Marie-Claude and me is not only dealing with Supreme Court decisions that you lose. Just reminder, and everybody in the room, the Human Rights Commission of Quebec lost the decision in Ward. So we then have to comply with what it entails. Doesn't mean it's what we argued, doesn't mean it was what we were doing before, but we do have in a country based on l'état de droit, which is rule of law, there is a limit to the powers vested in even chairs and presidents of human rights commissions. So that being said, what I want to explain and put forward to you is that in Quebec, we have a very distinct vehicle, and Stephanie alluded to that. The Quebec Charter was adopted in June 27, 1975, so 7 years before the Canadian Human Rights Charter. And it is not contrary to the other provinces in Canada or at the federal level, a human rights code. So it doesn't prohibit violations or discrimination. Not only that, it is a complete charter which has certain rights, such as dignity at Section 4, that is not contained in other statutes across Canada, nor at the federal level at the Human Resources Commission, exactly in the same language. So that's very important. And to that, I say with great respect to my learned friend Julius Gray, that words do matter, especially when they're in statute. That's what we're taught in law school. So when you look at the statute and the statute doesn't say the same thing as other statute, you must give it meaning. That's what's called legislative intent. And that's first year law school that I was taught at U of M, but McGill, they learned the same thing. So that's one of the main things that here, that's some of the reflections post-Ward have been ongoing. There's been meetings like this across Quebec, and there'll be one in Ottawa in January. There was one in Université Laval in March. There was one in Université Montréal yesterday, legal scholars talking about the Ward decision, its implication, and especially what we call in law the reading down of the Quebec Charter. What the Supreme Court's ruling entails is a reading down approach. It means the interpretation is a restrictive interpretation of the rights it contains. So faced with that, on a factual basis, as a Human Rights Commission, again, what we have to do as a difficult role is to receive complaints based on these new rules. These new rules that were put in front of us that we cannot escape. It's the Supreme Court of Canada. We can't go into appeal. Okay? It's just a quick reminder. The Human Rights Commission won before the Human Rights Tribunal, won before the Court of Appeal of Quebec, lost before the Supreme Court of Canada. So it's not something, I think it's a 5-4 decision. It's not something that it's black and white. There's a lot of gray zones, as you can hear this morning. But one thing is for sure is that if we want to face the facts, we have to understand that the Ward decision is a very specific set of facts that maybe hides something that is important for you to understand and know. And this is what we have put forward as a commission since the decision, is that the context, because we've talked a lot about the context in Ward is different from majority of complaints that the Human Rights Commission, Quebec Human Rights Commission, usually received based on these propos discriminatoires, or because that's the vocabulary we use in French to qualify those. Because they're not hate speech and they're not defamation, they're discriminatory remarks or words. It's another category that was used for 20 years before the Ward decision. And so that you understand, 75% of these complaints that we got were racist remarks. They were not based on handicap, and they were certainly not set in a context of a public humor comedian such as Mr. Ward. These are remarks that are made in mostly private settings, between neighbors, between people that deal in everyday life with one another, and that are not related to necessarily employment or another prohibited ground of discrimination. The only thing that's happening is you have two citizens without the denial of service, without services being involved, without employment, without renting, anything else, just saying blatant racist remarks. And before Ward, these cases were decided by the Human Rights Tribunal and taken up and studied by the Commission. Now, that's no longer the case. And that is the real impact of the Ward decision. That's the concrete impact of that decision. It means that that recourse that was open before is now closed. Whether I like it or not, or you like it or not, it's not my decision. It's the Supreme Court of Canada's decision. And there's two ways to change that. Another Supreme Court of Canada decision, or a bill laid before the National Assembly that changes the statute, which is the Quebec Human Rights Charter, to either make it so that that decision of war doesn't apply anymore to Quebec. So I could go on forever, but I know time is limited.
Thanks, Philippe-André. As you were both talking, awful but lawful, or lawful but awful, and I'm just thinking about the conversation we had before on impact on individuals and what have you. But for your two organizations, when a Supreme Court decision comes down like that, it must have a tremendous impact on the morale of your organizations and the people. Does that become an issue at all? I'm just curious, and maybe it's not terribly relevant, but it just jumped out at me that it must have quite an impact when that comes down.
There's nobody that comes to work at the Human Rights Commission, I think it's the same for Marie-Claude, that wants to not hear and entertain and take complaints to court based on discrimination. You don't come to work at the Human Rights Commission if you don't want to fight against discrimination. Okay, so for sure it has an impact, because you're told by the highest court in the land, oh, by the way, those files that you used to hear and push forward and go send to the tribunal, you can't do that anymore. So no, it's not a fun day at the office.
Good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Marie-Claude?
Absolutely. I think that it's certainly a good motivation to, again, raise awareness and talk about the gaps in legislation, in fact, in protecting what happened following hate and intolerance and hate speeches and these kind of words that they really matter for people. And we know that people in vulnerable situation and groups are targeted by these hate and words and jokes, and it have an impact on real human being. And as Human Rights Commission, yes, we assess complaints and we put that in front of the tribunal and we participate, but we also have a role in raising awareness and pushing for changes and have engage with stakeholders and make sure that it's going to be part of the public conversation, and we're going to identify gaps and we're going to address it.
Absolutely.
And we're going to push governments and authorities to address these gaps.
Great. Thanks to both of you for that. The word incitement has come up numerous times this morning, and I think, Pearl, you were the first one who suggested it, but this notion of there's speech and then hate speech and then hate speech with an incitement to discriminate, with an incitement to cause violence, harassment, whatever the case may be. What are the consequences of this for equality? What are the consequences of this for dignity, the human safety or security agenda, the self-respect, and the linkage here? Just if we can maybe unpack that incitement word a little bit.
I spoke about the consequence of hate and intolerance at length in my last 8 years. And for me, hate and intolerance shut down the conversation. It's a threat to democracy, it's a threat to human rights, it's a threat to security. We know that it turned one against each other. It's just provoke chaos. It's discourage people to run for office, to want to be engaged. And I think that freedom of expression need to be true for everyone. It means that if people cannot or feel not safe to talk because they are targeted by hate speech, what about their freedom of expression? What about their liberty to say and to talk and to be part of the conversation? And this is one of the consequences of what's happening actually with hate and intolerance online, amongst other things, and hate and intolerance in general in our society. And we're not immune about that. We can look on our other country and things that, oh, we're good in Canada and we're immune and we're not like others, but it's not true. This is not what we are experiencing actually, and this is not what we are seeing. We have to keep in mind that everyone now can be a broadcaster, and everyone can be hidden behind a screen or a telephone and spread everything. And no one is accountable for that. It doesn't make any sense. And it needs to be addressed, and sooner than later, and concrete action are needed. We are living in a democracy, and we're better to not take that for granted.
Yeah, well, the Commission in 2019 released a study because we were mandated to conduct a study based on hate speech and xenophobic and Islamophobic remarks in Quebec. And we did some interviews, and so our findings were similar to what you heard from the second panel from my colleagues at the Canadian Human Rights Relation Foundation. And we've been dealing with these backlash, and Marie-Claude alluded to it, even like we talked about journalists, you talked about public servants, you talked about government ministers not, wanting to run again because they're being attacked for being a woman, for being black, for being whatever, for being Muslim. So that atmosphere, that social atmosphere, where you've got this unfettered approach to be saying freedom of expression is limitless because I'm on the internet and I can say whatever the hell I want with no consequence. And again, that's the main issue for me and for us as a Human Rights Commission is when you're talking about public discourse and you're talking about collective versus individual discourse, and I think this is very, very important. Nobody wants to fetter free speech when you're dealing with complex social issues and you're dealing with issues that can be highly volatile. Just you say the word immigration, immediately you have an idea of your mind, for, against, more or less, whatever. Everybody has an opinion on it. But you need to be able to say to people, we can have a public discussion about immigration without making it so that it's hate speech or that you're saying that that person should have never come to Canada because that person is this and this and that. There's a huge difference, in my opinion, in my mind, between the two. Having a conversation about a social issue, a political idea, whatever, is very different from saying you should not be doing this or that or whatever. Okay? So, and if I may, just to give you another example of the impact of the Ward decision, there was a recent decision by the Human Rights Tribunal that the Commission brought before it, where you have a workplace environment, a joke, bad joke, a racist, so we'll not even call it a joke, we'll call it racist remarks towards colleagues that were at a restaurant. So what happened is that the one of the employees that was there was a racialized person and heard the joke 2 times, not once, twice. I can understand it had an impact on her. She didn't like it. She didn't feel welcome in her workplace environment. And that had an impact on her. And then in the next few days, her boss said, well, we're in a selling business. You don't seem too, joyful. You don't seem too energetic, whatever. And she fired her because the employee had complained to her that, well, I was subject to a racist remark. And yeah, sorry for not being, hey, cheerful about that. I'm not happy about that. And I'm going to say that to you. And she was fired. So we went to the Human Rights Tribunal. What happened? The decision was the joke in itself, the section 4 and 10, what Stephanie mentioned this morning, no damages, nothing. I can't do anything about that. It's just a joke. Supreme Court of Canada, Ward. But you're fired. So I can compensate you for that, but not for the joke. So again, what's the cause here? What's the thing that happened that started the whole thing? It's the racist joke. But what's happening is that we're stuck as human rights trying to find something else that we can attach the remarks to. So to be honest with you, and again, and I salute my colleagues that are in the room with me, it's never an easy thing to be Human Rights Commission, ever, at a federal or provincial level across the country. But this decision has made our work even harder.
We live in a time, we're seeing it in Canada, we're seeing it in the United States, we're seeing it in a lot of regions throughout the world, where there's a lot of toxic rhetoric out there. Marie-Claude, you just referenced it, I think, where the language of extremism, we're seeing it play out a little bit in the Commission of Inquiry with respect to the Emergencies Act and the convoy, et cetera. And a lot of people saying some very nasty things. I remember when I was the National Security Advisor having discussions with a lot of ministers of cabinet who were under threat every day, especially women, and telling me they weren't going to run again. And these were cabinet ministers. Are you both saying that even though the legal decision by the Supreme Court it's very specific circumstances. It's a comedy routine. There was no incitement to go kill or anything like that, but it's adding to that kind of a toxic atmosphere. And for some elements of society, they're going to interpret it the wrong way, and they're going to say, well, look, he can get away with it, so I can say whatever I want. And if I want to post something on the internet or on social media and say that cabinet minister should be butchered, that kind of creates that atmosphere. Is that going too far, or?
Well, and I go back to what Maître Gray was saying about the right not to be offended. And I understand why he's saying that. I understand the logic behind that. It's a very understandable logic. The problem with that is that the courts had already set up in place a number of decisions through which you had exceptions to that freedom of expression. And Pearl alluded to the Caligo case. Maître Gray referred to it also. So this is, again, it's in an employment setting. But the remarks that were made there were utterly racist. It was about Chinese workers there. And they were just blatant. I won't repeat them. You can go on the internet and find them and read them by yourself. They were just blatant remarks. And what the Court of Appeal of Quebec, because it didn't go to the Supreme Court, there was no decision of the Supreme Court in Caligo. It stopped at the Court of Appeal. It said that to be discriminatory, these kinds of remarks have to attain a certain threshold. It's not your everyday off-the-cuff remark like, where do you come from? It's not, you can't be offended by just normal curiosity or something like that. You have to go a certain threshold. Well, like always, these decisions, they don't say exactly what is the threshold, but they give us some idea. And that's what we were applying at the Human Rights Commission. So we weren't entertaining all the comments in the world made against everybody. We had to close some files based on the Caligo decision. Court of Appeal, highest court in Quebec, we're bound by it. But it let us entertain a lot of these complaints and push them forward to the tribunal. But now that, again, so the question is, the law of the land before Ward was not, there is a right not to be offended. It wasn't the case. I don't think it's genuine to say that, and with all the respect in the world.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. This is really important. And I think that balancing freedom of expression and other rights are really important or fundamental, but it's very difficult and we have to acknowledge it. And but I also think that the top court sending some mixed messages, in fact, and we have to keep that in mind. We have the Ward decision on one hand, and the other hand, we know that the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized the need to protect minority group from intolerance and psychological harm, and we know that. Then, I think that at some point we have to understand that freedom of expression is not just a one-way street, and hate is the greatest danger for freedom of expression, because in fact, again, we know that some people will not have their freedom of expression because other abuse of it. And I think that it's always the same people who are suffering of that. And we have to keep that in mind. And whose freedom of expression rights we need to protect, in fact, where we find the right balance. And I think that we may want to go back and focus more on the rest of the 11 hallmarks of 8, in fact, that have been established by the Supreme Court of Canada as well. And just, again, try to find the right balance and maybe reassess, again, in which kind of society we want to live and how we're going to deal with these mixed messages.
Well, that's a thread that's been running through the conversation throughout today, that balance, and that's the key word between freedom of expression and other rights and freedoms. And as human rights commissions, you walk that high wire every day. I mean, are there any tricks moving forward as to how you address that? You talked about the hallmarks, et cetera, but is there anything else you're thinking about in terms of how you can better strike that balance moving forward?
Well,
it's a very open-ended question.
Yeah, we had I would say a working set of rules that did not have it. That was not so broad that it entertained all comments. There was already this threshold in like I said, the Caligo decision. So what we were faced following Ward is to redefine this bar, but and this is the complicated thing in law, is that that bar will be moving now because there will be other decisions flowing. So we'll hear from other courts, and rest assured we're following each and every one of them and reading them closely and saying, did we put the line in the right place or not? That line is always a very difficult line to find. And once you've established rules, then it's much easier as a public body that has to apply the law to actually apply it correctly. And also, and this is something very important, because what I heard is I never like to hear somebody not having trust in institutions or not believing that the police or Human Rights Commission or whatever is not going to be able to solve your problem. That is not something I want to hear. But it's for sure, when you've got the rules of the games and they change, that's something for us. It took us some time to deal with it and everything. So you're asking, everybody, everyday citizens that do not deal in human rights each day in, day out, to actually, follow this topic and understand that there was this decision and before and after. You're asking a lot from a citizen to, digest and process. So it's a huge amount of work to accompany these people. So it's important to have groups, to have community groups, to have groups that accompany, that are there to explain and can bring these cases before other bodies, other courts. There are now, several complaints being heard by other tribunals. So maybe we'll see what comes out from that, and we'll, again, like I said, we'll see what the Ward decision in 5 or 10 years. What does it mean and what does it entail in Canada? Because I'd be curious to have a look at such a decision, a 5-4 decision, when you have such the debate based on new sets of rules, new sets. You're talking about, then I'll pass the puck to prevail the puck to Marie-Claude, but you have rules at the federal level. You have discussion about new bills being put forward. So depending on the changing nature of these bills and this legal landscape, we might have a different view or different discussions in 5-year time.
Yeah, I think that thank you. And I think that to combat hate, we're going to need a holistic approach. It's not one solution things. It's going to take studies. We know that there is studies actually on their way, but it's going to take all organizations, governments, and to working together to address this phenomenon and understand this phenomenon, that which is huge actually. And we just look at technologies and what people are dealing with. It's a problem. It's complex. And again, I just mentioned earlier that everyone now is a broadcaster. How we address it, how we make people accountable for what they are saying, how is, what are we doing with platform who are used to do this propaganda as well? This is an important question that we have to ask ourselves. But I just want to say that, I just want to say that, we may have laws and directives and regulation and everything that we want and as good as we want. It is about a shift of culture as well. Laws and directive and everything that we can imagine will just be as good as people will want to engage and really take that seriously and protect what they cherish as values, is diversity, inclusion, and having a democracy where everyone, not just some, everyone can have their say. And they can run for office. And they can thrive in Canada. I think that this is what matters the most.
So you mentioned the platforms, which is a perfect segue to the last thing I wanted to talk to you about. But before I get to that, I had the same reaction as you, Philippe-André, with respect to that word trust, which I heard come up a lot this morning. And in 30 years in government, going back to the 1990s, I heard there's no trust in public institutions. And I heard it throughout my career. Towards the end of my career, it had never been worse. We have no trust in the RCMP. We have no trust in the Canadian Armed Forces. We have no trust in this. We have no trust in that. But right now, and I heard it this morning, victims don't have trust. But then you have at the other extreme those who are fighting for freedom of expression, who want the government to stay the hell out of their lives, and they don't trust government because they're going to drop the hammer on them. And so there's no question, it's your answer. It's a comment that we've got to fight through. I mean, that's part of the environment as well. That's part of the atmosphere, and that's part of the polarization in the country right now. And this is just superimposed on it. But it makes for a very, very complex situation. But
What did Churchill say?
Churchill said all kinds of things.
No, but
the gathering storm.
the democracy is the worst.
Oh yeah, the worst. Yeah, it's the best of a bad batch, basically. So, okay, so we'll get on to an easy topic and online hate and that sort of thing. I mean, all the things we talked about this morning in terms of principles and this balancing of freedom of expression and other rights. When it comes to public policy, new legislation, new initiatives that the government's pursuing, I mean, the digital space is a scary one. Marie-Claude, you've talked about it a couple of times this morning. I mean, how do we apply this kind of a conversation to what we want to do online space? Where you use that word, another word that jumped out at me, accountability. So you got platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and holding them accountable for toxic language that's online. And we all know the government put forth some ideas, got hammered as part of public consultations. I think they've kind of gone back to the drawing board now. But can we learn anything from this morning's conversation as to how we move forward to things like that? Because that's kind of where the field is shifting to. Not that it's leaving the real world behind, if I can call it that, but the virtual space is where I noticed it in the last couple of years, watching it quite closely from a national security as well as a public safety perspective. It's particularly nasty, and the dialogue is downright vile.
Yeah, it's a complex questions that will need a multifaceted approach, and I just touch upon that in my previous answer. I think that's going to take an holistic and integrated approach, where everyone will be part of this solution. You know, often they are talking about reinstating Section 13. Section 13 in itself, even though if it done some good things many years ago, it's not enough in itself. We need much more than that, you know, and I think that this is what we need to keep in mind is, again, hate is a threat to democracy, is a threat to our security, it's a threat for human rights, and we need to have a conversation where we're going to take concrete action. And in this study that we are having actually should not create delay to take concrete actions, because it's an urgent and pressing issue in Canada.
You talk about Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Act that was abrogated by the federal government in 2010, 11?
Repeated in 20...
Something like that. 2010, 2011? 2011, thank you, Pearl. Yeah. Okay. So, and the caricature that you were showing was around that period of time. So that was that big conversation. In Quebec, what happened, there was Bill 59, for those who remember it. So there was actually a bill before the National Assembly by then the Liberal government of Premier Couillard that tried to, do something about hate speech, do something about, and putting some, increased sanctions. What happened? They just laid it before the National Assembly. There was a huge public outrage. This is, fettering freedom of expression. We won't be able to criticize religion. There's all mixed bags of criticisms that were, some were more legitimate, others less. But the government just pulled back. They just removed it from. So they didn't even send it to a vote. They just removed it because you're opposing freedom of expression to this equality provision, this real equality. And when you do that in the political discourse, it's highly volatile fuel. So it's something that makes it difficult for public institutions and government to deal with, because there is such either the media, the public, everybody will be and have an opinion on these subjects. So it makes for a very difficult conversation, even if you want to have that conversation in a on sound basis, on factual basis. Yeah. And when you want to fight discrimination and hate.
Yeah. Thank you, both of you. We've got about 5 minutes, or do we have to wrap up? Can I ask one last question? Okay, and I gave you a bit of a heads up, and yesterday, and you weren't sure you wanted to tackle it, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. And you're retiring soon anyway, so you say whatever you want. Okay?
Oh, no, it's not how it works.
But I know that.
But
I'm teasing you. I gave
yeah,
a speech just before I retired, and they almost fired me 2 weeks before I left. So I know what it feels like. I got that tap on the shoulder. Come and talk to the Prime Minister's office. We've got some concerns.
Yeah, and by the way, I do not retire. I'm too young for that.
I was going to say.
I had my mandate, but I will continue to advocate for human rights and and to stand for what I believe.
I hate the word retire, and I know you're going to stay very active. We're talking about this in a Canadian context, obviously, for obvious reasons, but we talked in a pre-call, I think yesterday or the day before, just about what's happening in other countries, and I said earlier what's happening in the United States, and these are problems that are not unique to Canada. Is there anything to be learned, whether from looking at other human rights commissions, how they're dealing with things? And again, they can only work with the tools that they have and the court decisions that are made and the legislation, et cetera. But can we look at other countries and go, boy, if we could only do it like that or that or that? Is there anything that could help guide us as we move forward?
It's a good question. What I would say, and when I'm looking at other country, and even though what's going on here in Canada, what I have in mind is Simone de Beauvoir words many years ago, when she was saying that, it's going to take cultural, economic, or war, or social, social condition crisis. Thank you, Melanie. I quote her so often that I don't know why. Maybe anyway, to have women's lost the right that they fought for 30 years. And I think that we can apply that to every human rights actually in Canada. When we look what happened around the world, and certainly in our neighbors, we can understand how human rights are fragile or at risk, and we should never take that for granted. This is what comes in my mind when I'm looking what's going on actually.
Just maybe just a thought on that, since the international level is more on Marie-Claude's side than on my side. But what I can say is that if you're looking right now at certain public discourse relating to the war in Russia and Ukraine, you're seeing a lot of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. So, and you see that in the United States too, in Florida with the Governor DeSantis. So you can apply, like I said, Marie-Claude said, you can apply that to human rights, so women's rights, racial group, LGBT rights. So you're seeing a lot of that rhetoric saying we've gone too far, we've got to scale back. There's a risk to tradition and values, and you're hearing that discourse. So when you're engaged in that kind of public discourse, it makes it even harder for, again, Human Rights Commission to try to, when we're pushing and advocating for this, it makes for a lot of headwind, let's just say that.
Marie-Claude, last word.
And don't forget, this is not just about the Canadian Human Rights Commission or the Quebec Commission or any commission. It's for every citizen to stand up for their value and what they believe in. We cannot just put the burden on organizations like Human Rights Commission. It's for everyone. And the responsibility of Human Rights Organization Commission is to engage with the community and rights holders and people who are suffering and have these conversations and make sure that we have all perspective and we understand well the impacts, allowing us to do some submission and to do the work that we're supposed to do to push for changes. But it's for everyone, and it's too easy to talk just about organization and say that, okay, it's not about me. But, when it do not touch us or a loved one or a sibling or daughters or sisters, sometimes we're indifferent. We do not take that for us. But when it comes to touch to someone that we love, hate, intolerance, discrimination, harassment, suddenly we stand up and we fight against it. And I think that I ask you, take 2 minutes today and just think about someone that you love you care for who is in a situation of disabilities or is racialized or is targeted or is Muslim and is targeted by hate and intolerance that we're seeing here in this country. Just take 2 minutes. How would you react? How I will react when I will see my grandson who is mixed heritage, Haitian and Mexican, 12 years old, going in a store and being targeted. How I'm going to react? Then ask yourself this question for 2 minutes. Thank you.
I think that is absolutely brilliant to wrap it up. That's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you so much to both of you for being so open and engaging. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of you. That was an extraordinary overview of a complex situation. I think you'll all agree with me. I hope you'll all agree with me that we're glad to have had Vincent chairing this session, despite his perhaps better judgment at the beginning. Yeah, that's right, exactly. So thanks very much. A couple of things to say just before we go into lunch. So Mohammed stole my thunder a little bit earlier, but we're going to be having a session to talk to give Marie-Claude the opportunity and the space to talk about her reflections around what human rights commissions do, what national institutions do on the eve, effectively, of her retirement. So Mohammed, thank you very much for having raised it. And it's just a fantastic opportunity, I think, to do that. I also want to say, I want to connect the beginning and the end of this part of the conference, because in 2000, and by the way, the initiative to start the repeal of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the one that made hate speech illegal under the Canadian Human Rights Act. The initiative to get it repealed started in 2011. The actual repeal went through in 2014. The important point here is that at the time we had Section 13, we had the hate speech provisions, we had the Canadian broadcasting legislation, both with regard to television and radio, that specifically prohibited these things. We had the legal structures in place. There was zero interest in the political establishment to actually enforce them. And this comes back to your point about culture, both of your points actually, about culture and context. And what I feel has changed in the last 10 to 15 years has been many of the students in this room, many of whom who do not tolerate this kind of thing anymore. And I think the reason why Incel, an article, I'm thinking about Julius's point earlier, I think the reason why people don't publish things about Incel isn't because criticism of women is unacceptable in the current environment. It's because Incel has been actively engaged in plots to murder women, which I think is really different than inciting discrimination or simply saying we don't like the position that women take. So I think there are some important distinctions to make there without in any way undermining Julius's point about the importance of being able to criticize openly. I also want to make that through line before we grab our lunch between, again, the conference that we held here a little while ago on online, the regulation of platforms, the regulation of online harm, the conversations we've been having today. Somebody said earlier, is it policy or is it law? A little preview to our course on law and policy. Law is all about policy, and policy is, of course, all about law. And law is one of the products of policy, but it's also a policy driver. And that whole idea of you know, it's awful, but it's lawful. Maybe it shouldn't be lawful, or maybe it should be. But these are intimately connected, yeah, as concepts, and I think it's important that we go forward understanding those connections. And Pablo's, and I think, important comments about human dignity and being careful about how we're using words in that regard. So,
30 seconds.
No.
Just, I think I heard the word terrorism once this morning, but just that fine line, the incitement piece, that when it is ideologically inspired, hence the term ideologically motivated violent extremism, incel can be a terrorist act at the end of the day.
Thanks very much for that.
Terrorism is ideological, it's political, it's religious, but there's a very fine line. And so that question of incitement to violence, it gets into terrorism, it gets into the criminal code. It's very complicated, and it's an important piece that didn't fully come out today, but maybe for another conference.
have another conference in front of us. The through line ending with something Mohammed referred to earlier, and that I know his team is working on, this idea of thinking through not only what the criminal code offers us as policy options, but also looking at different kinds of options that are available to us on the civil law side, on the human rights side, and on other perhaps venues, and we're having some of these conversations right now, to think through what that future might look like and to engage youth in those conversations. So we're delighted that we've had some of those preliminary conversations with the foundation, and really happy to give Mohammed and his team the opportunity to showcase that a bit.